Hey everyone, it's the Wanderer here, and I'm finally getting around to reviewing my Albion Knud. This sword comes from Albion Swords, located in Wisconsin, here in the good old US of A. Yes, both cheese and quality swords come from Wisconsin, making it one of the best places on earth. This particular sword is one of Albion's next generation line swords, meaning that it is inspired by and modeled after a historical original. And Albion is known as being one of the best, if not the best, production sword makers. So I was pretty excited when I got my tax return and actually had enough money to buy this sword. I waited 6.5 months for it to arrive. And overall, I'm pretty happy with this sword, but it does have a few flaws that I'm going to talk about throughout this review. So there was actually a period of time when I didn't even know if I would keep it. But it's grown on me. I've used it. I'm going to keep this sword, and I think now is a great time to go ahead and do the review. So let's go ahead and get started. So if you're familiar at all with Albion swords, you know that historical accuracy is an area in which they truly excel. And this sword is no exception to that rule. This sword is based off of an 11th century original that's found in the National Museum of Copenhagen. And Peter Johnson, a Swedish researcher and weapon designer, essentially modeled this sword after that original. Albion's so kind as to provide pictures of the original so that we can compare it to this sword and really see how it stacks up. Like the original, the Knud has a Peterson type AE hilt assembly and an Oakshott type 10A blade. Now that makes both the original and this sword unique in the fact that it's a transitional weapon. The type 10A blade originated, according to Oakshott, around the 11th century, which is really the end of the Viking era and the beginning of the age of chivalry. However, the Peterson type AE hilt assembly, even though it is a later Viking era design, it is a type of hilt assembly that is fairly common in the Baltic states in the later Viking era. So essentially you have a sword that represents a time period when the Viking pagan past, that you can see here in the hilt, was on its way out, and the Christian age of chivalry was on its way in, which you can see here in the type 10A blade. Now, a lot of folks might not be into this particular blade style on a Viking era sword. I think the main reason is that the fuller is quite a bit narrower than the wider type 10 fullers that you see in some other later Viking era swords. I find this to be more aesthetically pleasing. I don't like the wide fuller, so that's one of the reasons that I chose this sword. Now, like the original, the hilt assembly here, the furniture is very plain. The original was essentially just plain iron, and this is plain steel. But in its simplicity, it's still an incredibly interesting looking and really a beautiful blade. There's other examples of swords that have the Peterson type AE hilt assembly that are incredibly detailed and absolutely beautiful. The Suwantaka sword is probably the most notable among them, and you can get replicas of that sword as well. But this particular sword really stuck out to me. It's simple, it's plain, but it's beautiful, and it is incredibly historically accurate. So I'm going to give Albion a 5 out of 5 in terms of historical accuracy. So in addition to making historically accurate swords, Albion is really famous for making swords that handle incredibly well, and this sword is no exception to that rule. This sword is very well balanced, with the point of balance being a little over 5 inches from the hilt. I've got on these slippery gloves, and I know that one of these days the sword is going to pop up and hit me in the eye. Then I really will be like the Wanderer with one nasty eyeball. Adding to the balance of this blade is the fact that the furniture here in the hilt is pretty bulky. You got a big fat D-shaped pommel there, and you got a real fat guard here as well, meaning that the weight is going to be in your hand, not on the tip of the blade, meaning that you've got great point control, and it doesn't make this sword a burden to swing in any way. It is kind of like it's an extension of your body. Adding to that is the point that this sword has a pronounced distal taper. What that means is that the blade is thicker here toward the hilt than it is toward the center of percussion up here and then the point here. So again, that makes the blade heavier toward your hand where it needs to be to make this a fast blade and a great cutter. Now, in terms of flexibility, the steel that Albion uses is proprietary. They just refer to it as high carbon steel, and it is very flexible. This blade is incredibly flexible, as it needs to be to absorb shock. It's not whippy in any way, and what that means is when you're swinging the blade, it doesn't flop around, which impacts your edge alignment. However, if you intend to thrust with this weapon, it does have an acute point for a Viking era sword, meaning you certainly can thrust with it, but because it is flexible, if you thrust against hard targets, it is going to flex, meaning it's not going to be the best thrusting weapon. It has a lenticular cross section which lends itself more to being a great cutting weapon, but it's not the best thruster in the world. However, it does cut incredibly well. Albion did a great job sharpening this sword, contrary to what I hear in a lot of Albion reviews, and even with my terrible one-handed swordsmanship technique, I was able to cut through water bottles really easily, telling me that this sword did most of the work, not me, and it must be an incredibly good handling sword. Now, there is one negative aspect to this sword that I do want to point out. Many Viking area swords, most in fact, have a fairly small grip. This sword has a 3.5 inch long grip here. So if you've got tiny little Donald Trump hands like myself, it's not a problem at all. But if you have larger hands, because of the design of this guard, I guarantee you that it's going to dig into your hand, making it very uncomfortable to use this sword. My brother also used it, and he pointed out that fact right away. I also noticed that it's a little uncomfortable, but that was probably because I was riding up against the guard instead of keeping my hand a little lower. As suggested by Matt Easton with Scala Gladiatoria, I highly suggest you check out his video on gripping Viking era swords. It's very informative. So I'm going to give this a total of 4.5 out of 5 in terms of handling. The only reason that I'm taking half off is because if you have larger hands, this sword is not for you. I can tell you that now. It's going to be very uncomfortable to use. But overall, as with any Albion I've ever heard of or touched, this sword handles incredibly well. 4.5 out of 5 in my book. So let's talk about fit and finish. As I mentioned earlier, this sword does have some flaws, and it is in this area in which those flaws reside. In terms of the fit, I have 0 complaints. Albion does a great job with assembling their swords. This guard is hammered down onto the blade. It's not going anywhere. This is a peened pommel, and Albion peens their pommels in such a way to make them almost seem invisible. It's as if the pommel and the tang are really one piece, so they do a great job on peening their pommels. It's beautiful. You can't even tell that this is a peened pommel. They also did a great job on the grip, which is vegetable tan leather dyed oxblood. There are a couple areas where the oxblood dye isn't as heavy as it is in other areas. That's not a huge deal. You really can't even see it unless you step out into the light. So in terms of fit, great job, Albion. In terms of finish, there are some issues with this sword, but in order to see them, we're going to need to move a little bit closer. The main problem with the finish is casting marks. There's casting marks on the side of the pommel. There's also a very large casting mark on the bottom of the pommel. Additionally, there's casting marks on almost every corner of the guard, some of them being fairly deep to the point that they almost look like gouges. Additionally, when Albion did the acid etching on the blade, it almost looks like they got some of the etching maybe too much on the rectangular stencil that they use, and it caused a faint rectangular shape to be etched into the blade. Now, I'm sure that can be polished out, so it's not a huge deal. What does really bother me, though, is the fact that when they put the guard on the blade and ground out the hole, it looks like they did a little too much grinding on one side, causing the blade and the guard to look almost lopsided. This is very sloppy looking when you look down the blade, and it was the one thing that really struck me and really made me disappointed in the finish of the blade when I pulled it out of the box. Another issue that isn't a huge deal is the fact that there's grinding marks on the edge of the blade on both sides. When you catch these in the light, it looks a little odd and almost makes the blade look as though it's serrated. Again, not a huge deal, it could be buffed out, but it is something that I noticed, and combined with the other issues, really bothered me when I first received the sword. So when I first received this sword, those minor flaws that I pointed out were actually a pretty big deal to me, and they actually caused me to question whether or not I wanted to keep this sword. I ordered this sword through Christian Fletcher, who's a well-known sword maker and a very talented sword maker. You can order Albion swords directly through him from Albion. And I talked to him about the casting marks in particular, and he referred to them as character marks that are essentially seen on basically all Albion swords, even their museum line, due to the nature of the casting process that they use to create the hilt furniture here. Now I get that, and I know that it is something that can't be avoided with the casting process, but it really just seems to me that this sword has quite a few character marks, and maybe even a few too many for a $1,000 sword that I waited 6.5 months to receive. Behind me is a Hanwei sword and a windlass sword. They cost a little over $200 each. They don't have character marks. My Valiant Armory sword, a little higher quality than these, doesn't have character marks. So when I receive a sword like this, and it has quite a few flaws, cosmetic flaws, it is pretty frustrating, and like I mentioned, I didn't even know if I wanted to keep it. I'm over it now. I realize that it's just an aesthetic thing, and it doesn't impact the functionality of this blade or the overall awesomeness of this blade. And it does, I suppose, give it character, but it is a little frustrating. So I've got a favor to ask of you as the viewer. If you own Albion swords, or you've handled Albion swords, or any higher end sword for that matter, let me know if you think I'm blowing these flaws out of proportion. Let me know if you've got as many character marks on your sword as I have on this one. But because of those character marks, I'm going to give this sword a 4 out of 5 when it comes to fit and finish, and that is definitely not what I was expecting or hoping for in this sword. So hopefully it's just a fluke. Hopefully I'm blowing it out of proportion, because I've got an Albion Earl on the way that I've been waiting on now for 8 months, and I really don't want to have character marks in my Albion Earl. So I'm going to go with a total of 13.5 out of 15 for the Albion Knud. That's pretty good. It's not quite as good as what I was hoping for, but it is what it is. This sword and I actually have a history. It was the very first sword that I ever saw when I first became interested in historical reproductions. This was the first sword that I really fell in love with. But like many loves, once you get into a relationship, you notice some things that are a little annoying. Maybe she farts in her sleep, or puts the toilet paper roll on upside down. And there are some flaws in the finish of this sword that kind of bugged me at first, but I've gotten over it, and it's not going to make me stop loving this sword. I'm going to display it proudly and use it happily, because it is a really fun sword to use. So check it out, albion-swords.com. I'm also going to post the link to Christian Fletcher's website, because you can order Albion swords through him and pay with PayPal, which you can't do through Albion. So that's a real bonus for me, because I prefer to pay through PayPal, and I know a lot of people do. Also, Christian Fletcher designs and makes some really awesome swords of his own. He has a sword called the Shield Maiden with the Peterson AE Hilt Assembly, and it is absolutely stunning. If you like this sword, I highly recommend checking it out. So I hope you guys enjoyed the review. I hope it was informative. Please comment below about those character marks. I'm really looking for some feedback about that. Feel free to like and subscribe. I really appreciate you guys watching, and I'll talk to you in my next video. Hopefully the Albion Earl, and hopefully this month. Hint, hint.